Yes. All right, we've been doing quiz things and discussing the use of the Old Testament in the church a little bit. And now we're going to get to the grammar. And tonight we are on chapter 24, page 286. Life is good now, though. Please know this. Don't get the wrong idea. Your attention at this point should shift some, right? We've been focusing on, in the past, the grammar, the textbook, right? Read that, memorize stuff, really get this stuff down. You remember all the way back to, when we learned the alphabet and vowel points and long vowels and short vowels, and you remember all the way back to that, and we were just dissecting the grammar and spending all our time in the grammar and blah blah blah, right? And we're supposed to have been spending our time in the vocabulary, right at them, and then we've been doing a little bit of work in the text of the Old Testament. Now remember when we very first started, we started back in Genesis 1, and we did a little bit of stuff in that. But we didn't spend that much time in the text, right? All along we've been shifting more and more toward the text. Now with this chapter, we kind of get one of those watershed shifts, right? So we're shifting significantly now away from spending our time with our nose in the grammar. Don't get me wrong, you still need to read the chapter and, for detail and look at it and know what's in the chapter, but not nearly to the extent that we have been. Vocabulary is still critical, so there's no change in that. We are going to spend more of our efforts now on vocabulary and the text of the Bible, the text of Ruth, and the grammar drops to third place now, right, which is kind of cool. Because we've finished all the basic stuff and the cal stem, and now we are looking at the oblique stems. And so what we've learned so far becomes the foundation for jumping off into these other things. So, page 286, having studied the cal stem, you are now equipped. You feel equipped? You're now equipped to identify over 69% of all verbs in the Hebrew Bible. It is now time to begin our study of the derived stems and their conjugations. You will find it helpful to review the introduction to verbal stems. The good news is, and this is good news, not quite in a gospel sense, but almost. The good news is that no further paradigm memorization is required. The diagnostic approach to the derived stems does assume, however, that you have mastered the cal stem and all of its paradigms. So the grammar giveth and the grammar taketh away. You have to really know the cal stem. All right. Next paragraph, the meaning of the niphal stem. So now we're talking about the niphal stem and strong verbs. The niphal stem is used to express simple action with either a passive or reflexive voice. Now, this is an issue of the relationship of the subject to the action. In the active voice, the subject is doing the action. In the passive voice, the subject is being acted upon. In the reflexive, the subject is acting upon him or herself, or itself. Right? So, an active sentence, well, he uses an example. We'll just use his example here. Frequently, whatever a verb means in the cal stem, it becomes passive or reflexive in the niphal stem. For example, Shema in the cal stem is translated he heard. While Nishma in the niphal stem is translated either he was heard or he heard himself. Now, in the first example here, right, he heard, he is the subject. Who is doing the hearing? He. He was heard. Now, I could also add, and when you do a passive transform, which is what this really isn't quite that, but he was heard by Bill, right? So, if I transform he was heard by Bill into an active sentence, Bill heard him. So, in the active sentence, Bill would be the subject. In the passive sentence, he is the subject. See that? All right. So, he was heard. Now, he is the subject of the sentence, but he is acted upon, not doing the action. And if you want to specify who's doing the action, you would say by whatever. Right? Now, in a reflexive, the subject is both the doer and the receiver of the action. He heard himself. Right? The niphal may also be used with a reciprocal meaning as Nishma'u, they heard one another. That's plural, so you can see how that kind of works. The name Nifal will remind you that every verb in the Nifal stem takes a noon prefix. This prefix is unique to the Nifal stem and so distinguishes it from the other verbal stems. But sometimes the noon does what?
We found out.
It assimilates and becomes a doggish forte. It doesn't totally disappear normally, unless the doggish would be in the guttural, and the guttural can't take a doggish, right? You understand that, don't you? Is that amazing that you understand that? See, there you go. But the noon is there whether you can see it or not. Well, if you can't see it, it isn't there, but it's there in spirit. That's it. All right, so the conjugation of the Nifal stem goes like this. In the Nifal paradigms throughout the chapter, you'll notice that a noon is present in the verbal stem of every form. That is, in this chapter, that's true because we don't have any weak verbs, right? So in a strong verb, the Nifal is going to be there either as a Nifal or as a doggish forte. This is the noon of the Nifal. In the perfect participle and one form of the infinitive absolute, the prefix noon makes identification of the Nifal stem easy. In the imperfect imperative infinitive construct and other infinitive absolute form, the other infinitive absolute form, however, the noon prefix assimilates into the first consonant of the verbal root and remains as a doggish forte. Remember, first consonant of the verbal root. That's important. All right. So, what does a perfect look like in the Nifal? Well, Nifal itself, right, is a Nifal perfect 3ms from Pa'al, right? So the very name Nifal gives you an idea of what to expect in the perfect, right? So Niktal doesn't sound like Nifal accidentally, right? So what you have is in the perfect, you have the noon preformative telling you that we have a Nifal, and we normally don't, in the perfect, we normally don't have a preformative, right? Or at least, in the cow, there's not a preformative. It's not until you get into the derived stems that you can have a preformative. But it's not a preformative that shows person and number, it's a preformative that shows stem, right? So the noon of the Nifal becomes a preformative for the perfect, and you have vowel patterns like you see right there. Vowel patterns, just like Nifal, the name Nifal would suggest, at least in the 3ms form, all right? And because you have longer forms, things happen to the vowel forms, just like we've learned. All right? So that's fairly easy to recognize, isn't it? The thing you need to remember is that what we've learned before, and that's why we don't have to learn any more paradigms, is that blank, tot, t, u, ten, tenu holds for the endings for that. Right? So if you have those endings and a Nifal on the front, a noon on the front, right, and it's going to be a noon with a hirik under it, right, then you can tell you have a Nifal and you can parse it because you know those endings, like right? And you got to be able to recognize the vocabulary too, especially on a strong verb, right? Does that make sense to you? See how that works? So we're having vowel point changes. You can read all the details about how that's formed, but he gives in this box, this is useful, he gives in the box the diagnostic things to look for. So noon with a hirik under it and a patak under the second root letter. Now, patak is not perfectly consistent because sometimes you get a shiva if you look at those forms, but typically you have a patak under the second root letter. So you can see how to recognize a Nifal, right? Okay, so just look at that and let that assimilate into your brain, and you'll be happy. All right, the Nifal imperfect form is formed with the imperfect preformatives, the verb stem with the assimilated noon of the Nifal, and the imperfect subformatives. So what is he saying by all that? Well, look at the forms. All it is simply you have the same preformative that you had in the cow, the same subform. You have the same form, but you're going to have some change of vowel points and a noon assimilated. In other words, the very first root letter gets a doggish, but that's the assimilated noon. Do you see it right there? Okay, the kof and all those forms gets a doggish forte because that's the noon assimilated into that first root letter, and that's the sign of the Nifal. All right. If you look across the page, you can see what are the diagnostic indicators for a Nifal. Well, you have a hirik under the yod, or under the performative. But that's the same as the cal, isn't it? Okay, so the vowel point under the first letter of the word, or the performative, is going to be the same as in the cal stem. So what's our big thing that we're going to look for? Well, doggish in the first root letter, right? Just thinking ahead, the PL is going to have a doggish in the second root letters, right? Remember? So remember, doggish in the first root letter, not just doggish someplace, but doggish in the first root letter. But even more than that, because when we get to the weak verbs, if you have a guttural there, you're not going to see the doggish, right? So even more than that, in an imperfect form, you can recognize the imperfect form because it follows the preformative and the subformative that we've learned, yiktol, tiktol, tiktol, tiktoli, ektol, etc., right? It's going to follow that same pattern, except with some different vowel pointing, right? And what's the key difference in vowel pointing to point you in the direction of a nifal? Comments under the first root letter. So when it comes to imperfect, you're going to look for the comments under the first root letter. In the perfect, you're going to look for the nifal, the noon, in the beginning of the word, right? Noon in the beginning of the word, going to tell you have a nifal. That's why vocabulary is so critical, because you got to know whether the noon is part of the vocabulary or the noon is there because it's a nifal, right? You ever heard of a nikot? What's the llama doing on there? No, we've heard of a katal with a nifal because it's noon, with the noon because it's nifal, right? This is harder to say than you think. Yes.
Will you have a verb that its first root consonant is a noon, and then it's put in the nifal form? Does it just get a doggish in it? Yeah. Carry on.
That comments under the first root letter in the imperfect. In the imperfect, right? No, that's not that hard. Does it sound hard, Corey? Colby, Colby? Doesn't sound hard. Names are hard, but this is not.
It's because everybody knows it, though.
I know. He's just faking this up. All right, nifal imperative. How do you make an imperative? Well, in the second person, masculine and feminine, you take the preformative off the imperfect form, right? So that's what you do here. But in this case, you're going to throw in, notice the doggish forte in the first root letter, right? In the nifal, we're concentrating on the first root letter. Doggish forte in the first root letter, comments under the first root letter because it's derived from the imperfect, right? Then we get to throw a hey with a hurricane under it on the front of it. Don't be confused. That could confuse you, make you think it's a hifil, but it's not. It's a nifal. Right? Again, comments under the first root letter. Right? You can see on the next page, you see, a hey with the hirik and doggish in the first root letter and a comments under the first root letter. That's your sign. Here's your sign. All right, the nifil infinitive absolute. In the cow, we formed it by saying katol. Here we're going to say niktol, and that should not be surprising at all to us, should it? In terms of our vowel pointing and all of that. But there are two possible forms. Now, hiktol kind of follows the idea of the imperfect, where the noon assimilates and you get a hey hirik on the front of it, right? The niktol would be, you might say, a more regular way to form the nifal with the noon showing, right? And without the comments. The noon shows, so that is a good clue that it's a nifal, right? The only time you ever have a noon as a stem indicator is for the nifal. So the noon showing there, niktol, is a great clue. The noon doesn't show in the other form, the alternate form, but you have the doggish in the first root letter and the comments under the first root letter, like we're used to seeing. And the hey, like the imperative. Okay, and infinitive absolute. The infinitive absolute also has the whole and vowel characteristic. I should have mentioned that the imperative and the infinitive construct are the same form, right?
The what now?
The imperative and the infinitive construct are the same form. Look at the middle
we have
page
the same meaning. It's be killed.
Well, no, it doesn't have the same meaning.
One
is a command, kill, and the other would be just to kill.
To kill. Or killing.
So killing or something like that.
Killing would be...
It's a verbal noun. Yeah. That's right. All right. Now the nifal participle. All right. We know how participle works, but how do you form the nifal? Well, you simply use a noon, right? And now you have that commas under the second root letter, which is kind of strange. But here, the noon is the dead giveaway that you've got a nifal. And you really have participle endings. Same participle endings we learned as with the cow. Blank, et, im, ot. And it is possible to have an that footnote there tells you it's possible to have an ending for that form as well. Okay, so, you look over these, right? I mean, you're not going to have it down perfectly just by sitting through class, but if you look over these, you can get a little bit of a grip, right? And it's going to be okay. Remember, from now on, we're only talking about 30% of the verbs in the Old Testament. All right? We already have 70% of the verbs. We're talking about 30% of the verbs. And how many of those are nifal? You know what I mean?
When we started this, some of your words of wisdom, early words were, you'll forget it, that's a good thing, because that means you'll eventually remember it again. Well, I've forgotten a lot.
Well, see, that's great. You're that much closer to having it.
This looks really easy.
Well,
it does.
Here's the thing. Let's step back a step and take a lesson from a wise perspective. As a grammarian writing a beginning grammar, why do you think he is including the cow here next to the nifal? Because the average student needs it. Right? So if you need it, take comfort in the fact that that's why it's there. So again, remember, when you get to the next term and you're in your reading class, that's when you're still trying to get these forms under your belt and work them in. Remember, we've only been doing this a few weeks, right? And that, meaning once a week. Little kids are better at learning language than we are. We're old and calcified by now. And so a little kid in Israel, immersed in it all the time and hearing it every day, is going to take more than a few weeks to learn the language. Right? So, be reasonable about your expectations a little bit. Right, Adam? As long as you keep high expectations for vocabulary. It's key to life. Key to life. All right. There you go. Page 293. We see them all together. There they are in a happy chorus. And you can kind of compare them.
Actually, and I say that, it really is. It helps. Now, I get the big ones were the cow perfect and cow imperfect because it was almost reformative. And outside that, you just learn these things. It's not terrible.
And the two biggest categories by far in the Old Testament are going to be the cow perfect and the cow imperfect, right? And the other things get thrown in there, and if you can have a little recognition of those, what we're really trying to do is reduce as much as we can, forcing it to the dictionary, right? Now, we're not going to eliminate the need for the dictionary even for parsing, because to do that, maybe eventually you'll be at that place, but not in beginning Hebrew, because remember all the detail we would have had to learn with the weak verbs and everything to completely be independent of a dictionary for parsing, right? But if we know enough that we can parse 85-90% of the verbals, and we're only going to the dictionary for 5 or 10% of what we see, that's pretty good. I mean, I can do that. I can use that in my ministry. Right? I can do that. All right. So here's the point now where you can look at the vocabulary and deal with that. Great stuff. We talked about Exodus 3. This is great stuff from Exodus 3. Hope you have read that or are going to read that. The weak stems, the nifal weak stems, just the variations that we might expect from weak letters, right? What's going to happen if the noon wants to assimilate into a dogish forte, but the first root letter is a guttural or a resh, you're not going to get the dogish. It's just not going to be there, right? But you still have the same basic patterns of nifal in the perfect on the front of the word, same endings again, right? Endings aren't changing. In the imperfect, you still have that commas. That's the thing to glob onto. Commas under the first root letter. Nifal, yes, sir.
Now, are you gonna ask us? Are you gonna make us when we parse these in the future? We have to write cal, 3ms, and then nifal or whatever the stem is.
No. It's either cal or nifal
Or
PL. No, it never. It can't logically be cal or PL. Cal and PL.
You don't need to say this is from Katal.
Yeah, you do.
Perfect word.
No. You don't need to make reference to cal, but you need to give the dictionary form. So you will say nifal, imperfect, 3ms, maybe plus converses. If it's there, from Katal, which is the cal form, that's the dictionary form. From Katal to kill. You're always given the cal perfect 3ms form, unless it's a hollow verb, then you're given the infinitive form, right? But always given the dictionary form specifically, right? But cal and nifal and pl and hifil and hafal and all those occupy the same space, so it can only be one of those in that slot. Right? It's kind of like you can only be male or female, typically.
Even though originally you could say you came from a male.
Yeah. Well.
Yeah. That's my question.
Yeah. Okay.
And can you think of a nifal that starts with a guttural? Can you think of a word?
Oh, there are lots of them. We'll see them in the weak verb here chapters.
So you give me
page 299, first position guttural verbs. There's an example for you.
looking at the vocabulary on page 293. Be shot, be saved. He puts it in the cal perfect. We add the noon and make the appropriate vowel point changes. But like to be saved couldn't be a cal perfect, right? Could it?
No, these words don't appear in the cal.
Excellent. That's right.
They give us the cal. They still give us a fictional cal, cal 3ms.
Dictionary form, exactly.
Okay.
Yep, exactly. So you're getting the dictionary, like coon. That's not even the cal perfect. That's a cal infinitive right there, right?
Well, yeah,
that's a hollow verb.
No, naham could be right. Because it can be.
Naham. Lacham.
Yeah.
Could be one.
It could be. It could be something. You could see that naham could be a non. It could be an accurate cal 3ms.
The vowel points could be.
Oh, they all are. They all are except kun, hollow verbs.
Well, I'm just trying to think. Two-flight itself is not okay. So if you were to conjugate, it would be.
In other words, you're never going to see lacham in the Hebrew text. It's always going to be in a nifal form.
I'm sorry. I'm not trying to confuse. I'm just trying to think if it could be.
Does that make sense to you?
But as we're going through some of these nifals, we'll see some that verbs that are cal can also be nifal depending on the conjugation.
Yeah, but some verbs occur in the cal and the nifal and the hifil. Some verbs occur in the cal and the hifil and hafal. Some verbs occur not in the cal but in the pl, or in the pl and the nifal. So it's probably a rarity to find a verb that will actually occur in all the stems in the Old Testament, right? Most of the verbs are only going to occur in some of the stems in the Old Testament, or even in Hebrew language broadly, right? Because they just don't work, right? In all the stems. So you see what I'm saying? So you're not going to necessarily expect every word you learn to occur in all of the possible stems. And some of them don't occur in the cal. They occur in only the other stems. And the reason we pick katal is that katal is possible to work through all the stems, right? Because you can imagine, to kill, to be killed, to kill intensively, to slaughter, to cause to kill,
Kill himself.
But I mean, if you had the verb sleep, for example, Okay, I can imagine to sleep, but what is to sleep intensively? Well, maybe to really sleep hard. Okay, I can get that. But what is to cause to sleep? What, you hit them on the head? You know, you see what I'm saying? So some words just don't even work in some of those stems, right?
He slept himself.
Yeah, he slept himself. How do you do that? But the vocabulary form is still going to be in the cal, even though that form won't occur in these words. That form won't ever occur in writing, in actual composition, or at least not in the Old Testament. Right? I mean, it's like that with a lot of. There are probably verbs that occur in the cal, but they never occur in the Bible in the perfect 3ms form. Right? I mean, there could be words like that, but the vocabulary form is still the perfect 3ms form. You see what I mean? I'm glad you brought that up. I should have. That wasn't a good vocabulary lesson to make the first one. We just flew by. We were talking about that. All right. So weak nifal. If you get to page 303, what do you see? Well, you see that similar patterns occur, but sometimes you don't get the dogish when the noon is gone because of weaknesses. You can see when noon happens as the first. That's something to pay a little bit of attention to. What happens when a noon happens as the first root letter? Well, in the perfect, you don't get 2 noons, do you? Right? It just doubles up right there. See? And in other forms, you get a dogish in the noon. In the participle, you don't get 2 noons, you just get 1 noon. You see what happens? That's something worth paying attention to right there. Another thing we're paying attention to is what happens to a yod, and this happens in more than just the nifal and the other derived stems. It happens too. When your first root letter is a yod, it literally lengthens to evolve after the performative. Right? So yashav in the nifal goes to noshav. You see that? The yod turns to evolve. But you'll see that and you'll be able to get used to that too. So there's some more vocabulary, but that stuff's in the cal. Okay, do you have any questions about the nifal so far? Pretty easy, Now, when we get to the PL, what are we going to find out? PL sounds in the cal. It sounds like PL. There's a dogish in the second root letter, and in the imperfect. What are we going to get? We're going to get a patak under the first root letter. See? And just look through it there. So in terms of the grammar, it's a lot easier now, right? Than what it used to be. All right, let's break till 8, and then we'll get into